Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. In tonight's event, Professor Madras will discuss contemporary drug policy changes that are rapidly evolving and the complexity surrounding them. Without further ado, Bertha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. It is a delight to be with you and to share some of my views that I think are extremely important and compelling for our nation now and in the future. So what I would like to do today is begin by having a few comments about the what our nation's challenges are. We face an unprecedented challenge related to drugs. And this presentation that I'm giving is informed by three premises: that the harms of drug use outweigh the risks to the brain, to the body, and to the behavior; that some people can use with little or no consequences. We have to recognize that. But for others, drug use can lead to devastating consequences. The second premise that I'd like to focus on is that substance use and substance use disorders are not a victimless activity. There is impact on family, on friends, on community, on the workplace, on educational institutions. And the third premise is that drug use can compromise public health and safety. They are a massive economic drain on healthcare, on criminal justice, on productivity, and on the environment. The policy decisions that we adhere to now will affect this generation and the next generation and future generations for many, many decades to come. If we make financially or politically fashionable choices, we may enter a quagmire without certainty that our nation emerges healthy, secure on the other side. If we adhere to wise choices driven by solid scientific data, by wisdom, common sense, hopefully our current trajectory can change. From my perspective, drug policy should focus on making use of the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable. And the ALARA principle I borrow from the radiation committee, radioactive world where I've worked in over the years. We try to expose people to as low as what we can reasonably achieve. And that should be the operating premise of drug policy as well. So let me begin by quickly discussing the social and societal cost estimates from substance use disorders, their health consequences. 28% of all deaths can be traced to alcohol, drug, and illicit drug use. Death is more likely in adults from substance use that began in adolescence. The societal costs include disease, premature death, lost productivity, theft, violence, unwanted, unplanned sex, and so many others. The criminal justice costs are enormous, including interdiction, law enforcement, prosecution, incarceration. Consumers pay higher prices for goods and services, and employers and employees pay higher insurance premiums, and taxpayers have to pay higher taxes for healthcare, law enforcement, the judiciary system, incarceration, prevention, treatment programs, foster care, homeless shelters, and so on. And substance use can hinder economic growth. It diverts resources away from future investments. This is a scene from the Kensington district of Philadelphia. It could be the same scene in Mission Hill in San Francisco. Drugs and homelessness are tied to one another. Unfortunately, a significant percentage of people who are on the street are drug users. It is a culture that either is catalyzed by being on the street or it arises because a person loses their home related to loss of employment because of substance use. And there's so many consequences to drugs. This is the consequence of using tranq, this new form of fentanyl, combined with xylazine, which gives rise to not only what one calls zombie-like postures, but terrible skin lesions due to loss of blood supply, and also the vast number of needles, which can be hazardous for children playing in the street and so on. Let's try to begin with the points that I'll make today. Our drug crisis, our opioid overdose crisis, our current medicalization and legalization of psychoactive drugs, the weaknesses in our drug policy, and how we can inform better drug policy. Our drug crisis currently is the worst in US history, by far the worst. We all are aware that almost all our medications originally, but no longer, came from plants. Aspirin and anti-malarial drugs and so on were all isolated from plants originally. And so were pure products isolated from plants that produce psychoactive substances, cocaine from the coca bush and morphine from the papaver somniferum plant, the poppy plant. Amphetamine originally is a derivative of ephedrine from the mahuang plant, which is found in Asia. And we all are aware of tetrahydrocannabinol, which is derived from the marijuana plant. All of these have been produced as medications. Their derivatives they've been isolated and purified. But the problem has always been the conflation of medical with recreational use of these compounds, because these compounds produce psychoactive effects that are pleasing, that are desirable in a number of people. And so from the medical uses, sometimes they originated as recreational and then they morphed into medical or vice versa. What has been the end result of all this? From 1900 on, most accidental deaths in the United States declined. This is from Steve Pinker's book, a fellow faculty member. His book called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And this graph shows that from 1900 on, most preventable deaths from falls, from fires, from drownings, from poison gases or vapors, all declined very dramatically, except for deaths from drugs. They have risen and risen until now they have achieved unacceptable limits. What is also true in the United States is that the US leads the world in new psychoactive substances. Nitazines, which are coming on board now, which are alternatives to fentanyl, which is an opioid. Tetrahydrocannabidiol, which is an analog of THC from the marijuana plant. Tineptine, which is a gas station heroin. We lead the world in this. These new psychoactive substances can cause severe intoxication, seizures, aggression, agitation, psychosis, and there's so many unknowns related to them in terms of purity, composition, safety, toxicity, carcinogenicity, long-term risks, and death rates. And the question is, where does it end? If we legalize all drugs, will all these new psychoactive substances, there are over 600 floating around the world at the present time that have been identified, will they all have to be legal? And where will we draw the line between legality and illegality? And will this be a perpetuation of the war on drugs because there's so much unknown about them? Or will we just say, let every person engage in a human experiment without informed consent, and let's see how these things shake out? I think that's an unacceptable exit strategy for the new psychoactive substances. The US leads the world in youth cannabis use disorders. Again, we're number one. The US leads the world in prevalence of opioid use disorders. The US leads the world in drug overdose deaths. Compared with the European Union, we have far greater drug overdose deaths than the average of all the European Union countries combined, plus 2 additional ones. And lamentably, overdose deaths amongst 14 to 18-year-olds are rising now. This is unprecedented in our past, and it's because young people are being given or buy or take pills that are laced with fentanyl unbeknownst to them. These are deadly, and this phenomenon is new and unprecedented in our country. So what changed? What has made our country such an outlier in so many ways? And how can we attenuate this dubious distinction of being one for reasons that are certainly not acceptable from the point of view of public health and safety? Our culture has become more acceptable of drug use. The advent of chemistry has made a huge difference because in the past, most of the plants that produced chemicals that were active in the brain were simply consumed as plants or just simple extracts. But with modern chemistry came isolation of the active ingredients, such as morphine from the opium plant, such as THC from marijuana, such as cocaine from the coca bush. So no longer does one chew leaves in the high Andean mountains, but one can get pure cocaine and different forms of it that can deliver a free base directly into the brain. The isolation of these compounds also enabled the creation of new substances because chemists are always seeking something new and better. And so the possibilities now are endless. They are quite endless. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of fentanyl analogs that are possible. In terms of hallucinogens, that number is also equally great. My own lab, in an effort to identify cocaine medications, we synthesized, in collaboration with Dr. Peter Meltzer, we designed and he synthesized over 600 cocaine analogs. And imagine if one lab can do this, multiply that by 100. Modern agricultural methods enable the production of vast fields of poppies and of marijuana. Of course, they need herbicides, they need pesticides, they need a number of things which clearly are not necessary once you go into a chemistry lab and make compounds without the need for agriculture, but more on this later. Modern distribution methods, ships and planes and the mail service has enormously enhanced the ability of people to access these drugs when in the past they would be rare. Profits and power are behind much of this, as I will try to summarize shortly. And social media has produced a lot of misinformation, disinformation. They've also produced access for buying and selling these drugs. So these are all developments that have occurred in the past 200 years, and they've accelerated very rapidly. Just as an example of transforming legitimate medicinal chemistry to street drugs, this is a paper we produced in an effort to find medications to treat cocaine use disorder. And out of this paper, this is not a new compound. This had already been patented 30 years before. But somebody read this paper and began to call Dr. Meltzer and myself asking how they make the compounds. And pretty soon Flakka, which was this compound here, went on the street and 27 people died from Flakka-related overdoses in Broward County in Florida. This is not recent news. This is older news because Flakka has pretty much disappeared. Nafarone is another compound. This was made de novo by synthesizing it from pyrovalerone. And it was sold because it had legal status. It was sold as glass cleaner and jewelry cleaner in gas stations, and it produced acute sympathomimetic toxicity with restlessness and insomnia and hallucinations lasting 2 days in one person who was hospitalized with it. So people who look at patents, look at legitimate medicinal chemistry journals, they try and they look at PhD theses. They look at all these substances, and when they see something that's powerful, the lower the number, the more powerful it is. They decide they're going to make them and market them. And that's how some of these new psychoactive substances have come about. But let's get on with our current profound crisis. We start with the opioid overdose crisis. How did we get here? What lessons can we learn that will prevent future crises? What lessons can we learn in order to develop responses or to reverse engineering the mistakes that we made in the past, both policy and otherwise? The most important lesson I would say we learned is generational forgetting. Because in the 19th century, there was a vast increase in opioid use and morphine and opium use. And even in New England Journal of Medicine, our esteemed journal, which is held in Countway Library at Harvard Medical School, in 1823 and 1825, there were 2 articles, that's 200 years ago, on how to extract opium from the stomach in order to prevent an overdose, or also how to cause a person to vomit in order to prevent an overdose. They used acetic acid in this case, which is vinegar. So for decades and decades, prescription opioids were known to be addictive. They were known to cause the risk of overdosing and dying. And there was very, very little positive evidence. In fact, there was none that this class of compounds was safe for chronic use. They may have been safe for people post-surgery. They may have been safe for people who are suffering terrible pain from cancer, from an acute trauma, acute injury, but just to present them to patients for back pain, ankle pain, knee pain, there was no evidence whatsoever beyond a few months of safety data. And then once again, our esteemed New England Journal of Medicine came a 5-sentence letter to the editor. Addiction rare in patients treated with narcotics. And they examined whether or not, they examined the patient records of hospitalized patients. And they found that of the nearly 40,000 hospitalized patients, 11,882 received one narcotic, and addiction was considered major in only one case. Now, they conclude, despite widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospitals, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history. Now, I showed this to first-year Harvard Medical School students, and I said, what's wrong with this 5-sentence letter? And would you have published it? And within a minute, many hands were raised, and they showed the incredible weakness of this 5-sentence letter, which was that under acute pain in a hospital, which is very short-term use, there may not be any addiction, of course, but nobody knows whether or not these patients were actually screened for substance use disorder or opioid use disorder. Nobody knows what happened after they left the hospital. Nobody knows if they left the hospital with a prescription. But this was a loaded gun because the pharmaceutical industry used this 5-sentence letter to promote the fact, and they focused on the title and not the details, that addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. What a misfortunate thing. Well, from that came a lot of people citing this letter. Most letters to the editor get 10 citations at the most. In this case, there were 600 citations. Follow the leader. And all the dark blue bars showed that most of the citations were affirmational, meaning that they agreed with the conclusion that addiction is rare. It was only in 2017, after the disaster of our first wave of opioid use disorder with prescription drugs, that all the letters were negative and disagreed with the conclusions. But it took from 1981 to 2017 to finally put an end to the myth that addiction is rare. Low quality science received affirmation for decades. And the advocates reigned supreme and the skeptics were ignored. Because during that time, there were skeptics who said, wait a minute, this is not safe, this is wrong. Then there was fast investment of money to promote opioids with abuse potential. The blame for pain was shifted to the provider. Patient pain movements arose, saying there's a tragedy for needless pain. The pharmaceutical industry spent millions of dollars, and I have the records of how many they spent, on patient self-help groups, on clinicians, on detailing in doctors' offices, on pain societies. Shameful. By 1999, the Veterans Administration adopted pain as the fifth vital sign, and it mandated aggressive pain management. A year later, the Joint Commission that accredits healthcare organizations also adopted pain as a fifth vital sign, and there was tremendous pressure to make sure that pain was satisfied, the alleviation of pain, for accreditation and for reimbursement purposes. And then enter the political side of this, the Open Society Institute, that said patients in pain are casualties of the war on drugs. The medical community was under tremendous pressure by private and public regulators to begin to promote opioids for pain management because they obviously work. But no one knew if they were going to be safe and effective over time. Pain as a fifth vital sign became the focus. The guidance on how to prescribe opioids for pain was weak. There were tremendous financial pressures and incentives on physicians to use these drugs. The pharmaceutical industry educated the healthcare community on safe use of opioids. Regulatory boards, I won't name all of them, but there are many that waived oversight, and some of them were recipients of unrestricted gifts from the pharmaceutical industry. The Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services encouraged prescription opioid use, and patient satisfaction became a critical part of evaluating whether or not a person was practicing according to the common mode at the time. The FDA response was languid. Now, I've just listed a few of these. I'm up to 33 currently. The US led the world in prescription opioid daily doses. We prescribed 5 times more than an average of all the countries in the European Union, plus a couple of others. And interestingly enough, the US doesn't have more pain than other nations. We certainly don't. We're not an outlier in terms of pain. We became an outlier in terms of prescribing. We now have over 100,000 deaths due to prescription opioids in the past 20 years. It was economically inevitable, as Shulgin said in 1975, that there would be a transition from heroin, which is a field-grown, and morphine, which is a field-grown opioid, to synthetic opioids, because it was economically inevitable. So in 2010, heroin began to resurface in the United States. And if you look at the economics, this chart is painful, because if you start with a kilogram of heroin, which costs between $5,000 and $7,000 from Colombia, the revenue is huge. It's tenfold higher plus for 1 kilogram, $80,000. But if you look at fentanyl, which is lab grown, lab produced, you don't have to worry about fields. You don't have to worry about military helicopters dropping herbicides on the fields to kill the opium poppies. You don't have to worry about having your field workers arrested. You don't have to worry about transporting the poppies and transporting the opium juice from the poppies. You can make it in a lab, 99% pure. If it starts at about $3,000 to $5,000 for 1 kilogram, the profits are approximately $1.5 plus million, much greater profits. It was inevitable. So we have seen these waves and waves, these death waves due to opioids. The first one started with prescription opioids, then came a transition to heroin, then fentanyl, and then the wave 4 was fentanyl plus methamphetamine or cocaine. Wave 5, which is recent, is fentanyl and xylazine. Wave 6 was the COVID problem, which exacerbated the overdose crisis. And then wave 7 are now nitazines, and the US is awash with death. The percent change in 12-month overdose deaths is slowing down, thankfully. We have had over 1 million drug overdose deaths in the past 24 years. And it seems to be leveling off after a big surge in 2019 to the present time. But it was a travesty at that period of time. So what lessons can we learn from the opioids? Ignore history, generational forgetting, terrible, a terrible lesson to have to learn. Medical and public education was inadequate on negative consequences. Many people who became addicted, or their children, to prescription opioids have told me personally that if they had known that these drugs are dangerous, they would never have started them. There was inadequate or absent evidence for safety for chronic use. The benefits were oversold, the risks were minimized, science and skeptics were ignored. Vast sums of money were invested to promote these drugs to the medical community and to the public. Humanitarian pleas were motivated by financial and political concerns. Pain patients are victims of the war on drugs. There were no ballot initiatives to vote on them, but the medical community was unable to resist public and private and regulatory pressure. A new wave of unregulated high-potency drugs then entered the market. The crisis didn't stop with one drug class, obviously, because fentanyl is now combined with at least 3 or 4 other drugs. Diversion of medications was not anticipated. The medical and recreational use became an unenforceable distinction. Rogue clinics, pain clinics proliferated, and media promoted these drugs. We now have the same movement with medicalization and legalization of psychoactive drugs. And let's take a quick look at marijuana. A ballot or legislative initiative is now a method to approve marijuana as a medicine. It circumvents the Food and Drug Administration. And then The strategy was to legalize it for self-entertainment purposes. The strategy was actually articulated in a video that I've seen in 1979. So in 1996, Prop 215 was the Compassionate Use Act of marijuana. It permitted the use of marijuana for medical purposes, despite not having received FDA approval based on safety and efficacy. So let's take a quick look at medical marijuana, the reality versus the myth. This is a drawing of a 14-year-old girl who died of childbirth in the Negev desert. She didn't quite do it properly, but it was a breech birth, and she simply had too small a pelvis. Her pelvis was small by a couple of centimeters, about an inch too tight to enable the baby to go down the birth canal. And beside this skeleton, which was dated in the 4th century AD or CE, the Common Era, there were coins found of the emperors of the Emperor of Rome at the time, so that's how the skeleton was dated. There were ashes that were found, and these ashes were not near her nose, near her mouth, they were near her abdomen. And the idea was these ashes may have been burning a substance that could help in childbirth. It turned out the ashes contained metabolites of marijuana. So the marijuana was used at the time, and there was some evidence that marijuana could promote uterine contractions. So this is tangible evidence of its use as a medicine. But how have we devolved? If this is a medicine, were these qualifying medical conditions proven by quality clinical trials? No. If this is a medicine, why do different states list different medical conditions? Because if you look at Illinois, there are 40 chronic diseases. All this is science fiction. There is simply no evidence that they are, for most of them, I can't say all, but most of them, science fiction prevails in these ballot initiatives. It's been fraudulently hyped as a cure for opiate addiction, for glaucoma, diseases of cancer, Crohn's, post-traumatic stress disorder, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, hydrocephalus, or any other medical condition in which it doesn't exist. There's been a chasm between evidence and beliefs. There's no high-quality evidence of marijuana for chronic pain, perhaps for neuropathic pain, but people use it. They claim it helps them enormously. We cannot ignore that. But the type of evidence the FDA characteristically uses, it just doesn't exist. The adverse events may limit usefulness, including sedation, confusion, psychosis. At best, a few people with neuropathic pain will benefit. So in 2014, science and the law met in a courtroom. And in front of, this was the Eastern District of California Federal Court. Judge Kimberly Mueller presided. The defense attorney was Xenia Gilg. The defendants were people who'd been growing marijuana for so-called medical purposes in tracts of land that were in national forests. And there were U.S. attorneys that were present and assistant attorneys. And there was one expert witness for the Department of Justice. The court artist, not official one, but the one who published this, made it look as if I have these long talons as nails, and I circle them because I've never had long nails in my entire life. In any case, did marijuana fulfill FDA criteria in terms of purity? No. Dose, standard doses, quality control. Clinical trials were very limited. Safety and side effects. A specific medical condition to use marijuana. What patients may benefit? Have they been tested in children? Reported adverse effects, acute and chronic. How should the drug be taken? Eating, drinking, vaping. A safe drug dose for a specific medical condition. How was the drug made? None of these were fulfilled at that time. And the decision which came down from the judge in April 2015 concludes that on the record, this is not the court, the time. The court denies the motion to schedule marijuana in Schedule 3 or remove it entirely from the Controlled Substances Act. And the verdict was that marijuana remains in Schedule 1. What we have now is that the FDA has recommended that it be moved to Schedule 3. And under what basis? The basis is that there are so many ballot and legislative initiatives that have made this medical, and so many people seem to use it. Therefore, it can be approved. The same pattern could repeat for hallucinogens or new psychoactive substances. There is a corrosion of the FDA as evidence weakens and drug approval standards decline. What dose, what frequency, what disease, what ratios of THC to cannabidiol, how often, what medical condition is valid and post-marketing. So what has happened from Proposition 215 in California is that the legalization, which is the dark blue states, the medicalization, which is the green states, and the illegal states are the gray states. This movement has spread throughout the country. And at the bottom of this is huge investments. What has happened? We've had more products, more unregulated THC, more analogs, more routes of delivery, more false claims and advertising. Bud tenders are the people who go into dispensaries and recommend what kind of marijuana to use. We find that 12 to 17-year-olds use marijuana at much higher levels in legal states than illegal states. We find that marijuana use is increasing amongst teens. We find that adolescent marijuana users are more susceptible to brain changes, to addiction, to deficits in cognition, to amotivation, to psychiatric symptoms, especially suicidality and subsequently psychosis. We find that they have more functional and health deficits, and yet we continue to promote this drug in all sorts of venues. We find more use by pregnant women in the first trimester, especially in lower amounts in the second and third trimester. We find that the consequences of in utero exposure to marijuana is beginning to be understood now. The young children who've been exposed have more psychotic-like experiences. They have reduced gray and white matter. They have more functional problems and sleep problems. We have more psychosis in terms of emergency department mentions, violence related to cannabis use or withdrawal, more traffic accidents and fatalities, childhood poisonings, fetal consequences, hyperemesis syndrome, and addiction, even among those that are using for medical purposes. And we have a dose-related increase in psychotic disorders, particularly schizophrenia. This was done in 11 different sites, but the most robust sites were London, Amsterdam, and Paris, showing a dose response and potency response relationship. In a huge study from Denmark, which was co-authored by the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the US, it was found that 20% of schizophrenia cases may be prevented by averting cannabis use disorder, and they may be 25 to 30% for males who have this disorder. We have fentanyl death rates are higher in states that legalize marijuana. So we go on to the next category of drugs, which are hallucinogens. What we find with hallucinogens is that we are beginning the medicalization of drugs that in the past would not be medicalized. Ketamine was approved for treatment-resistant depression, a nasal formulation of it. But what has happened is that rogue ketamine Clinics have grown up without standard for the drugs. They're procured outside of medical norms. Only 35% require treatment training, or 12% only require physicians. There are no contraindications of ketamine in these rogue clinics for psychiatric conditions. There's no guidance on their use for youth, for older adults, pregnant women, and people in safety-sensitive jobs. And the FDA just released a warning about ketamine. So again, we have the same factors at work, except this time with marijuana, there are ballot initiatives, but not with ketamine, but so many of these criteria. Now we move to hallucinogens as medicines. We understand there's a large public health burden on chronic brain disorders and brain dysfunction. In some cases, the treatment needs are inadequate or unmet. There are many side effects for drugs that treat some of our major psychiatric disorders, as well as some that are conditions of internalizing disorders, depression, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. With drug policy, all premises are questioned. During the 1950s and 60s, and just very early in the 1970s, psychedelic research was incredibly popular. It's understandable because at that time, antipsychotic drugs and antidepressant drugs were just beginning to surface with regard to clinical trials. And psychiatrists were desperate to find magic bullets. It was abandoned. This research was abandoned, not because of Nixon's war on drugs, but because the psychedelics drew exuberant advocacy. They were used in unsupervised clinical practice for spiritual enlightenment. Clinical trials were performed with zero oversight. Bias was a norm. Some patient outcomes were dreadfully grim. I happen to know a few of them because I inherited the LSD from the CIA experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute, where some of these experiments were conducted and where I was a PhD student. Some became much more ill, some became irreversibly ill, and clinical use became supervised to avoid the 1950s and 60s research and misadventures, not only misadventures in the clinical research, but also in social misadventures. So now we have a renaissance of the psychedelics, and we have three questions to ask. How solid is the science? Can protocols be scaled with fidelity? And that's actually quite important because the way they've been designed currently is very cost and labor intensive. And if they are so cost and labor intensive, will they begin to exclude people who cannot afford them, poor people? And what is the reality of unintended consequences? So quickly, how solid is the science? The recruited subjects are some intrigued with hallucinogens, prior hallucinogenic use as between 1.9 to 100% in some of the studies. Is there selection bias? In some of the studies, out of 1,000 patients screened, 50 were chosen. Is there diversity? Most of the studies currently are conducted in Caucasians who are highly educated and urban, and they're college educated with high incomes. Are they all aware of expected outcomes? Of course they are. If they use the drugs, they know they're getting them. And they're all coached in terms of what to expect. The excluded subjects in some of these trials are people who have psychosis, who are suicidal. These are for treatment-resistant depression. These are excluded subjects. And for depression, with known risk factors for having psychosis, with a family history, a pre-existing psychiatric condition. These excluded subjects limit the true risk of the drugs. Prior hallucinogenic use. This is just an example of the studies that have been done recently up to 2021, starting in 2011. And these are the percent of people who have been exposed before these studies. What's most interesting is that the use is much higher frequency than in the general population. For example, psilocybin, approximately 0.6% of the population has had some exposure to them, but these are 60% up to 100% or 35%, which means that some of the subjects have been clearly have either volunteered or been chosen. And what about the protocols being scaled with fidelity? Here's an example of the type of music that's selected for a single session, carefully selected to resonate with the patient. There are generally 2 treatment providers, or 1 to 2, that hold hands that are present for the 8 hours. And then there's a pre and post session as well. And what about unintended consequences? Early warnings of public hallucinogenic use. It's the public use that concerns me the most. There were persistent hallucinosis following repeated administration of hallucinogenic drugs. These are papers that were published in 1964, 1970. Chronic psychosis associated with long-term psychotomimetic drug abuse. And basically, many of the clinical trials use 1 dose or 2 doses. Nobody knows whether or not the patient will develop tolerance to the drugs, whether or not they'll have to have repeat dosing, whether or not the conventional antidepressants will work in the case for antidepressant uses. And of course, as I said, the unethical research and unintended consequences surfaced with many books written by patients, by investigators, by family members on what happened during the 50s and 60s. And it's worthwhile examining this to see how we can prevent. And so far, I think the medical community is doing a responsible job in trying to prevent improper use in clinical trials. But what we're seeing is because of the hype in the literature, we've had an increase in emergency department entries and hospitalizations as a result of the hype. It's a small increase, but it's significant. We're also seeing an increase among teenagers because the media are reporting this magic bullet that may be able to solve substance use disorders. It may be able to solve PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, provide amazing insights. And so it begins again. Here was a pilot who was sitting in the jump seat of the cockpit, off duty. He took magic mushrooms 48 hours before a flight. He boarded the flight. He was sitting as I said, behind the captain and the first officer of the plane. And then he tried to shut off the engines at 35,000 feet because he was hallucinating at the time. And he's been charged with 83 counts of attempted murder. Now, this is an outlier. This is not a common occurrence, obviously. But with more and more access, with more and more hype about this class of drugs, I fear for the future. Have we learned anything from marijuana? Psychedelic reform bills increased from 5 in 2019 to 36 in 2022. 10 bills were signed into law, 32 are active, 25 states are considering 74 bills, and so on and so forth. This was an editorial I wrote saying the United States failed to prevent conflation of biomedical and commercial marijuana enterprises. The pattern should not be repeated with hallucinogens. And what is tragic is that it is being repeated because rogue clinics are opening up everywhere. So whether or not you believe, as Aldous Huxley did, that hallucinogens are the chemical opening of doors into the other world, a belief that drugs can procure gratuitous grace, or whether or not, on the other hand, you're of the mindset of Arthur Koestler, that chemically induced hallucinations, delusions, raptures may be frightening or wonderfully gratifying. In either case, they are in the nature of confidence tricks played on one's own mind. So the lessons learned from these four categories of drugs, I think, have to be studied in terms of drug policy, because we are witnessing now many drug policy failures, including decriminalization and legalization of psychoactive drugs without examining some of the consequences beforehand. Rescheduling of marijuana, which is de facto going to be legalization, destigmatizing drug use. I firmly believe that people with a substance use disorder should not be stigmatized because it could prevent them from seeking help, from being open about their problems, from being able to acquire treatment. But what about the role of parents and culture? How, if we destigmatize drug use, what can parents say to their children? Treatment failures or compromises. Abstinence is not a goal anymore in some treatment communities, and there's some data on whether or not that is effective or ineffective, and terrible treatment failure recruitments. Let's take one quick look at policy decisions. The Oregon decriminalization experiment, I owe a great deal to Keith Humphreys and Rob Bovitt, who wrote an excellent overview of it. In 2000, Measure 110 was approved by ballot, again, to decriminalize or legalize all drugs. It was branded and measured as a rebuke to the war on drugs, to remove criminal penalties for all drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, to reduce the harm that drugs cause to their users, allocate more than $250 million for treatment, to naloxone distribution, to employment, housing, voluntary treatment, end penalties, reduce the stigma of drug use. They thought that users would now access harm reduction services because they would remove the shame or fear to seek treatment. There was a belief that there would be a surge of help seeking, of reducing drug overdose deaths, of racial disparities in health, in criminal justice system, lower rates of incarceration, and safer neighborhoods. All these were hypotheses. All these were hypotheses. April 1st, 2024, 4 years later, Governor Kotek repealed the 110 because it didn't reduce Oregon's drug problems. They got much worse. Touted as racial justice policy, the support for repeal was especially strong amongst African Americans and Hispanics who were unduly affected by it. Drug overdose deaths increased 43% in the first year of implementation and kept rising. By 2022 to 23, the overdose deaths rose to 41.6%, highest among all states, with a national average of only 2%. There was a complete failure in help seeking. People who had drug possession were given a $100 ticket, but no criminal penalties. Now, if they called a toll-free number, the fine was waived, and they would get a health assessment to encourage treatment, but more than 95% ignored the ticket without consequence. Open-air drug markets exploded. Violent crimes exploded. They flourished and rose dramatically. The gentle pressure to seek treatment was ineffective because most people enter treatment with pressure from friends, from families, from employers, from health professionals, the law. The pressure was eliminated. In California, they urge people to use fentanyl with friends. Destigmatize the drug. Know the overdose. Do it with friends. Use it with people and take turns. Use fentanyl and take turns. Try not to use alone. The failed drug policies in several West Coast Pacific cities was just daunting. The drug policy focuses on reducing overdoses almost exclusively. Drug use and addiction are not viewed as a priority or problem, nor is treatment and prevention. Housing first, to yesterday's headline, $23 billion in California was allocated for housing first. The homelessness is rising and the money has no accountability. Personal autonomy is valued more. The strategy is failing. What this whole shift is a shift towards harm reduction, which began as a grassroots community action in response to HIV/AIDS among drug users. People who used drugs began to distribute sterile syringes to limit HIV/AIDS. By the late 1990s, and currently there were over 136 organizations that distributed naloxone with syringes as well. And it's associated with a very robust drop in HIV and hepatitis C. And if combined with medications, the transmission was reduced by more than 2/3. So this grassroots movement was very effective because it was a movement by users to try to help themselves because nobody else was helping them. But what we have now is a movement, especially amongst people with substance use disorders, to try every form of experimentation and harm reduction. So let's perhaps not focus on abstinence, but reduce use. There's some studies that have come out showing that if you reduce use, you increase function. There are functional improvements with cocaine or methamphetamine. What you can see clearly from this graph is that abstinence produces the greatest of the functional improvements compared with reduced use or no reductions in use. And that is true for psychiatric symptoms. It's true for addiction severity indices and also for craving and so on and so forth. So what is clear is that we have listened perhaps too carefully to only one side of the issue. To destigmatize people with substance use disorder, absolutely. But to destigmatize all drug use, problematic. To medicalize psychoactive drugs by ballot, problematic. To normalize drug use and legalize all drugs, problematic. Because those new psychoactive substances will cause court cases for millennia to come. Harm reduction, naloxone rescue, absolutely support. Medications to treat opioid use disorder, the data are crystal clear that they are essential for a large percentage of the population. Sterile needles and syringes reduce HIV prevalence and hepatitis C. But meet them where they are and leave them where they are is beginning to enter into the community of treatment providers. Let them decide when they're ready. Let's not make abstinence a long-term goal. Let's provide drug-free paraphernalia. These are solutions that I think are very questionable. So I would urge you to look at some articles that are written by Keith Humphreys and Jonathan Calkins in The Atlantic. Destigmatizing Drug Use is a Profound Mistake, by Sam Quinones, who's written some spectacular books as well. America's Approach to Addiction has gone off the rails in a time of fentanyl and meth. From my perspective, drug policies have to look at every single system involved, including supply, including prevention, risk factors, and we have to examine the cost benefits of every single one of these. A systematic approach without dreams of this is what we should do because maybe it'll work out, because those maybes can lead to consequences up to and including death. We need to increase our ability to motivate people into treatment. because the vast majority of people, over 90%, do not perceive a need for treatment. They think they can handle it on their own. They're not ready to start. They're not able to cut back. They don't know where to get treatment that would cost too much. They're worried about what people would think. All of these reasons they give for not seeking treatment, these are reasons we have to tackle. In support of mandated treatment, there's always a certain form of coercion or urging of people. But ASAM physicians, 60.7% endorsed mandated treatment, especially for heroin, opioids, and for alcohol. Some opposed it because they thought it would jeopardize patient rapport, and others wanted more education and more research on it. How do we treat an overdose rescue? With a heart attack, in the first 24 hours, people are brought to a CCU, there's continuous monitoring, blood tests, medications, they're in contact immediately with primary care or cardiac care, and they're stayed 2 to 4 days in a hospital with monitoring, with an opioid overdose, which can cause tremendous high risk for death. They're rescued. They're back on the street. They're more likely to die. And 40% of hospitalized patients for opioid conditions, they had no follow-up care within 30 days. This has to change. We have to treat an opioid overdose as seriously as we treat a heart attack. Untapped resources. If fathers or mothers use marijuana, their offspring are more likely to use marijuana. And this is true for opioids and other drugs as well. Even 80 to 30-year-olds living in the same household. Parents have been ignored in prevention, and yet they are key determinants of substance use. Parents who have strong disapproval of use, their children use much less than parents who don't have strong disapproval. And our beloved Vice President for Advanced Learning, our VPEL organization, and Harvard X, we are in the process of producing a program, a 10-hour program on adolescent drug use in the US, what caregivers need to know. Finally, I would like to conclude by saying, in many ways, I sound like a fossilized, pearl-clutching person who has been in the field possibly too long, but always warning about the what-ifs and the potential outcomes, like Cassandra did in Homer's Iliad, and like Laocoon did in Virgil's Aeneid, that the Trojan horse is being introduced into our country, and the outcomes are unknown. I say this over and over again. I do not think we're waging a war on drugs. The brain is the repository of our humanity. And what we do by trying to reach as low as reasonably achievable drug use is to defend our brain, the repository of our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bertha. We're going to take 2 questions before we wrap up. First question is, taking away the morality aspect, what is the harm to society when you have a functioning quote unquote addict?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons to learn, certainly from my perspective, is to talk to families of people who have members who have addiction. And in some cases, the entire family have substance use disorders. In other cases, they don't. But as I started with my introductory remarks, I do not think that drug use and substance use disorders, especially SUDs, are a victimless activity, because there is the steady state is almost unheard of. People get better, people get worse, people age out spontaneously, people get better because of treatment, or they get better because they have internal resolve. But throughout the course of substance use, if one is a member of a family, there are people who are concerned, who are suffering. And from the perspective of the family members that I have had so much interaction with, it is a very difficult situation for them. So I do not think that it is a victimless activity. I think it also can affect a person's work. Not 100%, not necessarily. There are people who can use. Carl Hart claims that he's been using heroin for many decades of his life, and he's functioning very well, thank you. There are those spokespeople who do seem to function very well. But I don't think, based on statistics, that that is the majority. And I don't think that based on the growing field of examining the consequences to children, to parents, to siblings, that there is no suffering at all. And certainly with regard to healthcare costs, they are higher amongst people with substance use disorders. And there are also more workplace accidents. There are many other consequences. We just don't have time to go into them. But it's an important question. And I agree with you that there are people who really feel, given the surge in drug overdose deaths, especially opioids, how do we address the shortage of accessible treatment services? I think that's a critical question. Carlos Blanco at the National Institute on Drug Abuse has calculated that it would take 10 years. If our numbers did not change, it would take 10 years to bring the workforce up to the needs of the community in terms of treatments providers. I think what we have to do is probably two things. We have to increase medicalization of treatment. We have to remove barriers and restrictions, for example, for methadone from physicians' offices. We're beginning to do that. We remove the X waiver, but we also have to couple that with increased training for people. I think we have to increase the training workforce enormously. And I have proposed on a number of occasions that medical schools should have divisions of people who train in behavioral health that work alongside physicians so that behavioral health experts can assist physicians who are busy in other forms of practice needs and practice demands, that they can have a collaboration and a work group that can address these behavioral health issues.
Thank you so much, Bertha. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you will join us for more signature events soon. For more information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, please visit vpal.harvard.edu/vpal events. Thank you.